My name is Tony Stephen. I get to be the minister here at the West Church, and you're really, really welcome with us this morning. A couple of things to tell you about at the start, and the first is that we're going to have and get to celebrate communion together today. And what we're doing at the moment is we're doing a bring your own. So if you have brought your own, that's fantastic. But if you haven't brought your own, then don't worry about that. We have bread and wine at the back of the church at the right point towards the end of the service. You can go and collect if you need to. But if you brought something to eat and drink for yourself, that would be fantastic. The other good news on that front is that after the service, we're able to invite you to stay behind for tea and coffee and to spend some time with us. Well, so that's exciting. We are here together to worship, and it is a privilege to take part in this communion service towards the end as well. You'll hear a little bit more of that during the service about what that means to some of us. You're also going to hear some opportunities to get involved in lots of different ways during our time together, and we're going to focus again on some of the more powerful stories that we are wrestling with about Jesus of Nazareth. As we come to do that, let's pray together. We're going to use words that's known as the Lord's Prayer. They're going to come up on the screen, and they've got lots of our and us ideas in them because it's a prayer that we say together. So let's do that. Let's pray. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts, as we forgive our debtors. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. We're going to see our children's story this morning up on the screens. On the video this week, it's by the Star family.
The man who wouldn't forgive. One day, Peter asked, "Master, how many times should I forgive someone who keeps wronging me?" Religious people agreed that it was fair to forgive a person 3 times, but Peter generously suggested, "How about 7 times?" Jesus smiled and shook his head. "No, Peter," he said, 70 times 7 is nearer the mark. Listen to this story. There was once a king who decided to check the accounts of his officials to see how much money they owed him. He had scarcely begun when one of them was ushered into his room. "This man owes you a huge sum," the king was told. The king consulted his books and found that indeed the servant owed him millions, enough for a king's ransom.
"Sell him and his wife and his children as slaves,"
the king ordered. But the official fell on his knees and sobbed out,
"Please have mercy on me. If only you will be patient, I will pay it back."
The king knew very well that he would never be able to pay back such a huge sum, but he felt sorry for him.
"Get up. I'm going to write off your whole debt. You don't need to pay me any of the money."
The delighted servant jumped to his feet and bowed himself out of the king's presence. No sooner was he outside than he bumped into a fellow servant.
"Here, stop. You owe me some money."
His victim nodded miserably. "It's only a very little bit of money."
"It's only a little bit of money.
"Give me time to pay you back."
"Give me time to pay you back."
But the other man caught him by the throat, half throttling him.
"Pay me back at once, or you'll go to prison,"
he threatened. Then he kicked the man out of the palace and threw him into prison. The rest of the king's officials were horrified. They told the king the whole story. The king was very angry. He sent for the first official.
"You are a wicked, hard-hearted man. Servant, I forgave you a huge debt, yet you have refused to have mercy on someone who owes you such a tiny sum. Because of that, you will go to prison yourself until you pay back everything you owe to me."
"Remember," Jesus said as he finished his story, "God will not forgive you unless you forgive one another from the bottom of your hearts."
In the midst of what we all know is kind of unprecedented times, with the climate crisis causing havoc around the world, Brexit, the pandemic isn't over yet, and now we have a war on our doorstep. And against such a backdrop, it seems a bad time to be inviting you to come to a course on persecuted Christians. You might not have the wherewithal inside of you, you think, to take on something else. But just as it refreshed that woman to go and see about other people, I think maybe this is a time when we could do this and be refreshed. I've had a heart for the persecuted church ever since I became a Christian 40-some years ago. And I started supporting something that was called Keston College, and it's now called Christian Solidarity Worldwide. A little bit like Amnesty, only supporting Christians and other people of other faiths who are being persecuted for their faith. And they have teamed up with 24/7 prayer to do a 6-week course for Lent on the story. They're calling it Stories from the Wilderness. So it's highlighting 6 different countries and individuals who have suffered for their faith. I've got a little clip that Brian's going to put on, which will show you a little bit of a taster of what the videos are like, and then I'll just tell you the details.
The day after they arrested many of my friends, they called me, they ordered me to go to police office. I remember I called my mom and I said they called me and I have to go. My mom said, if you think you need to hide yourself, I can help you. Through one of my family members, I went to church for the first time, and yeah, I had this experience to be in really presence of God for the first time there. In Iran, it's not easy to talk about Jesus. It's very dangerous. It's banned to have Bible, and I couldn't stop talking about Jesus. The day they arrested me, they put me in solitary confinement. It was most difficult experience in my life, but I can say it was the best experience in my life. It was so hard. I'm not a hero, and I didn't like to be alone, and I had to be alone in solitary confinement for 25 days. I can live without food and without water, but I cannot live without Word of God.
So if you can join me, I don't want to be alone up there in the Centenary Hall, so 15th of March.
I want to tell you about one particular communion service as a pointer to what communion can mean. It was some time ago, the last Christmas that my father was alive, and he hadn't been out to church for some time. So it was in my parents' flat in Southampton. There were just 6 of us, my parents, Meg and myself, and our eldest son, Dave, and his wife. And my father was frail and anxious and confused, and initially didn't want to be involved. What we did was very simple. First, Dave read to us the story from Luke chapter 24 about the 2 disciples on Resurrection Day walking out to Emmaus and meeting Jesus and not recognizing him until they shared a meal together and he broke the bread. And we shared bread and wine. 2 remarkable things happened. I've forgotten something, sorry. Before we shared the bread and wine, we sang a simple old communion hymn together, which I hope my father might remember. It begins, "Gathered, Lord, around your table, now we seek your face. Let us know your presence with us, Lord of grace." And two remarkable things happened. First of all, my father sang the whole hymn, all 6 verses, without the words that I printed out being needed. But secondly, his face was transformed. It almost seemed to glow. We were quite shocked. It was so remarkable. He died a few months later, but my abiding memory of my father is of his shining face as we sang that communion hymn together. The 2 disciples hurried back to Jerusalem and shared how Jesus had been made known to them in the breaking of bread. And I think that can still happen. This is not the only meaning of communion, and it's not the only way in which Jesus makes himself freshly present to us so that we see him more clearly and realize in a fresh way what he did for us on the cross, what it means for us today. But for me, it is central that he still makes himself known in the breaking of bread.
Today's reading is from Luke chapter 8, reading verses 40 to 46. Now when Jesus returned, a crowd welcomed him, for they were all expecting him. Then a man named Jairus, a synagogue leader, came and fell at Jesus' feet, pleading with him to come to his house because his only daughter, a girl of about 12, was dying. As Jesus was on his way, the crowds almost crushed him. And a woman was there who'd been subject to bleeding for 12 years, but no one could heal her. She came up behind him and touched the edge of his cloak, and immediately her bleeding stopped. "Who touched me?" Jesus asked. When they all denied it, Peter said, "Master, the people are crowding and pressing against you." But Jesus said, "Someone touched me. I know that power has gone out from me."
I wonder what you think of when you think of Jesus of Nazareth. I wonder if you think of a holy man. I wonder if you think of a miracle worker, miracle man. I wonder if you think of some kind of superhero. If you have a first slide, I think those are the first ideas that are up there. These are ideas that are out there in our popular culture about Jesus of Nazareth, from kid stories to books, to movies, to all sorts of ideas, and comics that people make. But is that how Jesus of Nazareth presented himself, and is that how Jesus of Nazareth was presented to us in the accounts that we have of his life and his death and his resurrection? Instead, when we look at the accounts we have of Jesus of Nazareth in the first century, and we listen to what he said and we look at what he did in the 3 years that we know most about, instead we find a teacher, we find someone who goes around and talks about demonstrating or announcing or revealing in the acts that he does, a project, a much, much bigger project that is not just about him, but it's about his Jewish story and about the God of creation, a story that begins with a set of poems about a God creating order from chaos and finishes with images and visions of a time when that whole creation is put back together, and somehow Jesus is at the centre of that. In one of those accounts, next slide, all of the accounts actually that we have of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, the 4 that we have, we call them the Gospels, and that word means good news. But in them, they talk about Jesus himself, talking about bringing good news, and a particular kind of good news. And in the book that we've been looking at the most recently, a book called Luke, he talks about specific good news for specific groups of people. Next slide. And those are the poor, the outcast, the prisoners, the oppressed. These are the kinds of people that he believes he's announcing and actually demonstrating the good news for. Next slide. As we started to read today, We've got to the part in this book called Luke, chapter 8, when Jesus is faced by, this time not somebody who is screaming and shouting, which has been the last story on the other side of the lake, but in this time it's someone from his own Jewish tradition, a synagogue leader. And they were actually fairly suspicious at this point of what Jesus was doing and saying. And at this point, a man called Jairus, who's a leader at the synagogue, comes and he throws himself at Jesus' feet, and he obviously feels that Jesus somehow can help him in his situation. And we're told his situation is that he has a daughter, a girl of about 12, who is dying. And Luke includes details for a reason. So we know that he has a daughter, and this is his only daughter, so that makes it all the more poignant. That she is 12 years old, and that she is dying. And he's asking Jesus for help. He obviously has some feeling that Jesus can help at this point. Most of us at this point are thinking about family situations and thinking about the tragedy of a young child that is dying. But if we look a little bit wider, and if we take a pause, then we might see a little bit more in this story. Because it's not just the detail that this is an only daughter and her life is threatened. In a Jewish situation, the idea of death, it has all sorts of things connected to it. Because in their rituals and in their customs, death and anything surrounding death, and the dead body and the place where dead bodies are, brings something called ritual uncleanness or ritual pollution. It means that you're excluded from worship, from society for a set amount of time. And so there are other things going on. Next slide. And then the next slide. Luke, then, because he's an artist, because he's got an awful lot of things going on, pauses. He pauses in his story, and we don't hear any more about the girl for a little while. Instead, we hear about a woman. Next slide. This time we hear that there is a woman who has been subject to bleeding for 12 years. Now again, knowing that the young girl is 12 years old and then hearing that the woman has been ill for 12 years is not an accident. Luke wants us to put these stories inside each other and see them together. For 12 years, no one has been able to heal her. And then another layer is added on, because if we pause, like Luke has, and think of the first century, and think of the first century Jewish society, then we'll know that not only has this woman been ill for 12 years, she's been completely excluded from worship, from society, from her family, because just as death and corpses and anything connected to that makes you ritually unclean and excluded from what's happening, also illnesses that involve your skin, and illnesses that involve things coming out of your body, and in particular, with women, bleeding, mean that you are ritually unclean and you have to be excluded from all sorts of things. So for 12 years, this woman has been excluded from not just her health, but from society, from worship, from her family. No one could heal her. But the story tells us that she has trust. When the story talks about the words faith and the words believe, it's the word trust that's behind it. Her trust is that in some way, Jesus can help in this situation. And so, next slide. She pushes her way through the crowd of people. She touches the edge of his cloak. Now we're probably speaking here about a prayer shawl. Jewish teachers would have a prayer shawl over their shoulder with tassels around the edge, and this is probably what she touched. And immediately her bleeding stops. She was right. But the story doesn't stop there. And Jesus doesn't stop there. Next slide. Because he asks a question. He knows something's happening. He said, "Who touched me?" And one of his disciples, Peter, obviously says, "This is ridiculous. There's a huge crowd around here. How can we work out? Everybody is crowding around and pressing on each other." But there's two little details in here that really stand out for me. The first is this idea of touch, that somebody has touched Jesus, especially someone who is bleeding, because if you touch a Jewish man when you are bleeding as a woman, you make him ritually unclean. So there's a huge risk in this. The second thing is that Jesus doesn't know who touched him. I remember I asked, what sort of ideas do you have about Jesus? Is he a holy man? Is he a miracle man? Is he a superhero? Jesus knows something's happened, but he doesn't know exactly what has happened. And it's easy to get the idea that Jesus is some kind of all-knowing, all-seeing person who wanders through life, always knowing what everything around is happening, exactly what everyone is thinking, and that's not how it's presented to us. Jesus doesn't know. Jesus is fully human like the rest of us at this point, and and who he knows something's happened because this power of God is connected to him, and something's happened, but he doesn't know exactly what, and I love that. Peter and the disciples say, look, this is ridiculous, how are we going to work this out? But Jesus says, no, I know that something's happened. And next slide, the woman, keep going to the next slide. The woman is then given the opportunity to change something that was done in secret to something that then becomes public. She has a voice. She gets to tell her story. She explains what she's done and how she has been instantly healed. And she goes from this point, because it would be so easy at this point to look at this and say, well, the amazing thing here is that she's been healed. In reality, what the amazing thing is what's not in this story, and that she can now go back to her family. She can now go back and take part in her society. She can now go back and get on with the life that she was made for, what she couldn't do up to this point. Next slide. Next slide. So what has been happening meantime with our little girl? Well, what has happened is that Jesus has dandered around so long with this woman that the girl has died. An interruption has got in the way, and perhaps if that interruption hadn't got in the way, or perhaps if he hadn't tried to do too many things in front of him, he could have got on with dealing with what he'd been presented with first. But Jesus doesn't respond as if this interruption has been a big deal. Next slide. Many of us, and I am one of the strongest in this, feel that when we get interrupted in whatever we're planning to do, that it's a disaster. That all we want is to get past the interruption and on to what we thought would happen. That things get in the way, and those things are a problem, a distraction from what we think we are about to do. But instead, the story of Jesus is a story of someone who takes each situation and takes each person and seems to then be fully present and deal with them not as an interruption, but as the next part in the story and the next person to deal with. And so for him, this woman is not an interruption. And how many times am I trying to do too many things? Or how many times do I feel that what I'm doing is actually getting in the way of what I should be doing instead? Maybe I could learn to be more present and to take people and situations bit by bit and understand that perhaps the interruptions are as much the story as what's coming next. Next slide. Jesus says one of his most repeated commands at this point. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. And then he says something curious. Next slide. He says, stop the crying, because there are mourners already who are screaming and shouting outside. She's not dead but asleep. And some people look at this story and they think, well, she's just in a coma, or maybe she's fainted. And Jesus understands this, but other people don't, and he's going to now wake her up somehow. But that's not. Commentators will tell us that in the first century, in the Jewish society, the idea of someone falling asleep, meaning death, was a common phrase. And all the people around about also, they laugh on purpose as well, because they know that she really is dead. This is not just a mistake. Next slide. Jesus then takes her by the hand. He speaks to her, and she comes to life. She is restored. And again, the temptation is to leap ahead and think that the miracle in this is that she is now alive. She was dying and then dead. But for me, that would be to miss a tiny little detail again, and that is that Jesus took her by the hand. And that contact is all the way through these stories. The woman touched the edge of his cloak and should have made him ritually unclean. Jesus, by even going into a room where a dead girl was, should have then become ritually unclean, and certainly touching a corpse is the last thing you do as a Jewish man or a Jewish teacher. All the rituals and ceremonies you then have to do for the next while. Because of that, that makes you ritually unclean. But it seems in these situations, Jesus doesn't become ritually unclean. Instead, the opposite happens, that he changes the situation. That the miracle is not just that a girl is restored to life, is at the end of the story, a woman is going back to her family and the life that she was made for, and a family here is now restored, and a young girl is now eating with her family, and then can go on to live the life that she was made for. And that is the good news that Jesus seems to continue to talk about. For me personally, for the people in these situations, I don't believe good news is a holy man, or a miracle worker, or a superhero. Good news is the issues, the barriers, the problems, the things that are getting in the way of the creation project being taken away so that people can get on with the life that they were made for. And that's what Jesus lives out, that's what Jesus is announcing, that's what this whole story seems to be. Next slide, and this is our image outside, inviting. An invitation, inviting us to join in with, inviting us to respond to. And we can respond in lots of different ways. Next slide, and that's our other image. With closed hands, or perhaps with more openness to the invitation that Jesus has. What Jesus demonstrates is a God who wants to be with us. And that's there in the word communion that we use for what we're about to do. A God who wants a world where people are able to be part of their families, their societies, of worship together, and are able to, just like that young girl, eat together with their family. And that, I believe, is one of the reasons he gave us a ceremony that involves eating and drinking together. Let's prepare ourselves to do that together. If you need to go and get some bread and some wine from the back, it's time to do that now. Bring that back to your seat and we're going to take communion together. The peace. Not an easy peace, not an insignificant peace, not a half-hearted peace, but the peace of the Lord Jesus Christ is with us now. Let's share it with each other. We can't move around and hug each other quite yet, but we can wave and smile at those around us. Peace be with you.